Thank you all for coming, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the next in the series of the Joseph C. Miller Memorial Lecture. My name is Lewis Doney, and I'm responsible for Tibetan Studies here at the University of Bonn, and it's my very great pleasure to be able to introduce a fellow colleague here in Bonn and also in the EOR. Julia Hegewald is Professor of Oriental Art History and Head of the Department of Asian and Islamic Art History at the University of Bonn. She was a reader in art history at the University of Manchester from 2007 to 2010, a postdoctoral fellow at the South Asia Institute at Heidelberg University from 2005 to 2007, and a research fellow at the University College, Oxford, 1998 to 2005. Before that, she studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies, another thing that we have in common, where she gained her PhD in 1998 with a thesis with the title Water Architecture in South Asia, a study of types, developments, and meanings. Since then, she has completed her habilitation in 2008 from Aachen with the habilitation shrift, Jaina Temple Architecture in India, the development of a distinct language in space and ritual. So we can see the great expertise that you have in this topic. And since coming to Bonn and the beginnings of the cluster, you've moved towards fields of dependency, and you have published the Jaina tradition of the Deccan, the Shravana Belaga Gula, Muda Bidri Karkala, and embodied dependencies and freedoms, artistic communities, and patronage in Asia. And I understand you have another work forthcoming. This is amazing, and we're looking forward to that. Entitled Jaina Culture in Medieval Karnataka, Dominance, Dependency, and Endurance. So, without further ado, I'll welcome Julia Hegewald to talk about Jainism under threat, extreme forms of dependency in medieval Karnataka, South India. Please.
Louis, thank you so much for this very kind introduction. I feel very honored to have been asked to present the J.C. Miller Memorial Lecture this afternoon, and I'm delighted that so many of you are here in the seminar room and also on Zoom, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion. The study of dependencies is an investigation into who has access to resources which others have not. And this unevenness results in distorted power relations and asymmetrical dependencies. This is kind of a premise which I think many of us here work on, and I'm trying to show how this implies to the situation I'm working in. And the main aim of bearing these things in mind, the main aim of the Jaina religious community in Karnataka, who will form our focus today, is the attainment of salvation. And in addition, the Jains aim to obtain the largest support for their own particular paths. Therefore, the story of dependencies in medieval Karnataka is a story of who offers the safest access to deliverance and which group appears to be the most powerful religious movement in the area. Moreover, as religions and politics are always tightly intertwined, the dominant religious group also has access to the greatest royal and societal power, to financial funding, and also to physical protection. And we'll see that these all play an important role. They can also most easily control economic exchanges, such as commerce and trade. There's still one seat here or one over there. As such, the discussion in this paper today is about rivaling religious groups, the support of rulers, and the power of economics. So I will not be focusing on art history, which I usually do, but I'm summarizing kind of the final results of a large long-term research project, which I'll be telling you about in a moment. Now, whilst from the 2nd to about the late 11th, early 12th century, the Jaina community in Karnataka dominated in most of these dependency-related areas, they lost this comfortable position, definitely from the early 12th, definitely to the 13th century, when they became severely dependent on other faiths. Now, let me explain more precisely what situation we are dealing with. Jainism as a faith group is as old as Buddhism, dating from about the 6th century BCE, and also finds its origins, can you see that here, in the northeastern state of Bihar, in which also Buddhism originates, and the faith reached the South Indian state of Karnataka by traveling down the east coast, probably, of India, and reaching Karnataka, which you can see here on the west coast in the south of the country, and it probably arrived in Karnataka in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Now, from the 5th to 7th, it depends always which area of the state we are talking about. From the 5th to 7th centuries, the influence of the Jainas rose to a focal position of supremacy in the region very fast. And at this time, Jainism yielded considerable influence over the religious, the political, the cultural, well, all aspects of life of the people in the region. And between the 8th and the 10th century, this is a phase I will continue referring to, because this is a phase when kind of Jaina culture really explodes in Karnataka, blooms extensively and reaches its high point in the 10th to 12th centuries. And this is a time during which not only Jainism flourished, but kind of non-Vedic heterodox religions more generally. So it's also the time of Buddhism, of the Buddhist expansion kind of in India, when heterodox faith groups were flourishing. Now, I want to at first give you a couple of reasons for this enormous and very fast gain, this rise in importance, and then talk about its decline, because as you will see, the reasons for the rise and the decline are incredibly intertwined, and often a reason which initially favors Jainism caused or contributed to its decline later on. Now, reasons for the steep rise in the of the Jainas to supremacy in the region are that from the early centuries of the Common Era, the Jains received strong support from a number of consecutive dynasties. Jainism is a highly ascetic faith. So here on the left, you can see one of their saints, an ideal, he's called Bahubali. You can see that the ideal of Jainism is to reject all belongings, to reject all connections, and for men, for ascetic men, for monks, even to reject their clothing, because they've also rejected their feeling of shame. Yeah, you completely control your desires and you have no belongings. So Bahubali stood so long in meditation that creepers, plants, started growing over his body. Yeah. So Jainism as a highly ascetic faith, which propagates battling against one's own desires, interestingly, absolutely appealed to the martial kings, the warrior kings at this time, because to them, they appeared to be an ideal of the warrior, not the physical person fighting, but the person, succeeding over his desires completely. And interestingly, also, actually, many Jains were generals, high-ranking generals, and both the statue here on the left of Bahubali and the Chamundaraya Basadi here on the right, the temples of the Jains in Karnataka are referred to as Basadi. This comes from Sanskrit, Vasadi, meaning temple, but the term Basadi is actually only used for Jain temples. So these two are late 10th century statues or temples, and they were funded by a very famous general, a Jain general known as Chamundaraya. Furthermore, Jainism, which came from the northern, the Aryan, the Indo-Iranian regions, and moved into the south, we've seen from Bihar into Karnataka, bestowed respectability to and raised the status of the Dravidian, the South Indian warrior classes. Now, we've heard that the rulers converted to Jainism because it appealed to them as a religion. Then also the ordinary people followed suit. Merchants and farmers, for instance, converted. And the teachings of Jainism did not only appeal to the warrior classes, but also to the trading classes, because for them it was especially easy to live by the tenet of ahimsa, which means non-injury. Because if you plow the ground, you uproot animals. If you work in a factory, you use maybe excessive use of fire or water. So being a trader, it was quite easy not to harm any living beings. And soon the Jains dominated the merchant classes who controlled enormous assets. And this temple here, the Nagara Basadi in Shranabelgula, it's a royal donation, but the Nagaras, the traders of Shranabelgula, paid for its upkeep. So they paid for the maintenance of the building, the rituals conducted, the payment of the priests. So this shows the importance, it's called the trader Basadi, the trader temple, giving them status. Now, a further issue which contributed to the rise in popularity of Jainism was the relatively tolerant approach of the Jains towards other religions and their practices. And this has often been explained with the tenet of Anekanta or Anekantavada, which means that the Jains did not only support one god or one principle or one belief, but that they believed that different theories and religions could coexist. In this, maybe we can describe it as a tolerant approach, the Jains absorbed many converts and changed their religious practices, especially during the 10th century, for instance, by welcoming converts from Hinduism, through which castes were introduced to Jainism, which they didn't have before. And we'll come back to that point in a moment. Also helpful for the rise of Jaina authority appears to have been the diversification into a number of smaller subgroups, suiting different groups of people, So one subgroup which was especially successful and appealing, for instance, to women, was that of the Japanese, because whilst mainstream Digambara Jainism doesn't support that women can reach enlightenment from within a female body, the Japanese spoke in favor of that. They said everybody, women can reach enlightenment. So many women converted to this form of Jainism because it appealed to them personally. The liberal and more open approach, especially of some Jaina subdivisions, such as the Japanese, starkly increased the Jaina following, especially between the 8th and the 10th centuries. And this growth in numbers led to an enormous boost in donations. And this resulted in vast construction of new Jaina temples. And from the 11th, 12th century, these became, as you can see on these images, larger and more lavish. We have the Kamala Basadi in the top left, the beautiful facade of the Brahma Basadi at Lakshmeshwar below. The ceiling here, you can see on the inside, an enormous wells and decorations is from Halebit, and below these pillars inside the mandapa at Hangal, they are lace turned on a lace, a practice which we normally only know from wood, working in wood. But I would also argue that this lavishness also shows the growing importance of the Jainas and also their more this worldly approach. They move away from asceticism and from being simple and plain to kind of grand architectural structures. Now, in the context of the devotional bhakti movements, what are the bhakti movements? It's a movement which starts in Tamil Nadu in the 6th century and which propagates a loving relationship with a single divinity, a god, which it reaches sort of Karnataka in the 10th century, exactly at the time when we have this boost, this expansion in Jaina influence. So in the context of this Bhakti movement of becoming more devotional, yeah, also the pantheon of Jaina divinities increased exponentially. So on the left slide, you can see the view into a hall, and you can see the multitude of images suddenly appearing here. Now, the emphasis is really on the jinnas or Tirthankaras. You can see the white in the back, or also here at the front. These are human beings who have reached enlightenment, who have, there are 24, which kind of act as models for the Jaina society. Now, gaining especially in importance were goddesses, the Yakshis, and I'm showing you here on the right, the Yakshi Kushamandini, who form part of Shaktism, the veneration of the female principle, and they also play a particular role in tantric cults. So Tantrism is an esoteric yogic tradition which from the 8th century influences Hinduism, Buddhism, and also Jainism. Yeah. Now, these changes, I would argue, made Jainism more attractive. They made it more human. They made it less ascetic and made it also particularly important to women. You know, suddenly there were female goddesses to venerate and to relate to. Kushamandini carries a child. She's the mother. You know, you can relate to her. Now, in order to interact more directly with the laity and to forge closer links, some of the formerly poor and homeless, wandering, naked ascetics, as we have seen, settled down in monastic institutions known as mattas and elected orange-robed administrators, the bhattarakas, to run their affairs. I'll show you an image of these later. In addition, the laity was also invited to participate directly in ritual proceedings. These can be quite small, as here on the left. In the center, you can see that they can be monumental. This is again the statue of Bahubali, which we saw at the beginning, every 12 years. It's anointed with cooling and purifying substances for 10 days. But this involvement of the laity also meant that they were involved in fasting, so they could temporarily become an ascetic. And it even involved offering the laity the possibility to die a religious death by strictly supervised self-starvation, known as salekana. And you can find memorials of sites where people died a religious death marked in these pavilions. Okay, these are all reasons for the rise, which helped Jainism to prosper. Now we'll look at the decline. However, the enormous expansionism and growth of Jainism, especially during the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, brought the Jains also into conflict with other faith groups in the area. From the late 11th to early mid-12th century onwards, Jainism lost most of its authority and was relegated to a position of severe asymmetrical dependency. This was a time of great political volatility, resulting in many small petty kingdoms through feudatories declaring themselves independent from their rulers. From the 13th to 14th centuries onwards, especially in central and northern Karnataka, Jainism became a disempowered minority. The Jains were persecuted and their sites of worship destroyed and annexed. And I'm showing you here on the right a decapitated jinnah where the genitals have been sliced off because they were kind of seen as offensive. It was stolen by Hindu communities, but it's now displayed in the Kush Mahal Palace in Warangal. And on the left, you can see the view towards a shrine, and on the door lintel in the middle, you can still see the seated jinnah showing that it was a Jain temple. But looking into the shrine, you can see that the image has been stolen. It has been removed, and only the very elaborate pedestal, the altar, has been retained. This period of discrimination and oppression lasted at least until the 15th, and in some areas even until the 19th century. And the reasons for this decline had never been examined in detail, and this was the subject of an Eminöter research group funded by the German Research Foundation, which I headed, and for which I continued to do research in the cluster of excellence, and for which, as Louis said, I've just submitted, hopefully, my final book publication. Now, due to the large number of players involved in these historic, political, economic, social, and religious changes, it really affects all areas of people's lives. We are confronted with diverse and even conflicting narratives and interpretations. Largely, the causes can be grouped into voluntary and internal reasons, which the Jains caused themselves on the one side, and external or imposed reasons on the other. Now, the first and most important cause leading to a decline of Jainism in Karnataka was the breakdown of royal support. We've heard initially how important it was that kings converted, and that they sponsored Jainism so generously, which played such an important part in its growth. Now, with the rise of the Kadamba rulers and Ganga power in Karnataka, under which these two early temples, you can see they're much simpler than the ones I showed you before, Jainism flourished. So the Kadambas ruled from the 4th to the 6th century, and the Gangas from the 4th to the 10th century. And Jainism gained further support under the Chalukyas in the 6th to 8th, the Rashtrakutas in the 8th to 10th, and the Hoysalas in the 10th to 14th centuries. But you can see they're very short-lived dynasties, and the Jains were quite lucky that there were so many following one another, which were, supporting Jaina concerns. But at some point it tips, it changes. So both the Rashtrakuta and the Ganga dynasties, who were such strong supporters of Jainism, severely lost in power pretty much at the same time towards the end of the 10th century. And this is really the start of their decline, because from the 10th century, monarchs, their ministers, and feudatories changed very quickly, very suddenly, frequently, leading to a highly unstable political situation. And at the same time, also patronage from other political and financial benefactors. I mean, there were not only kings supporting them, but also the local feudatories, the aristocratic levels of society, the merchants. They also stopped supporting Jainism because the king was not supporting this anymore. So this was not, you go with the religion favored by your ruler, because you form a kind of unity. So along with this financial loss, also went the loss of importance and physical protection. You were not you were not favored anymore, kind of. As such, we can conclude that the first and most detrimental reason for the decline of Jainism was the withdrawal of political and financial patronage. And this caused a particular problem, as during the 8th to 12th century, the Jainas had so enormously expanded their number of temples, of monasteries and mattas, but also of charitable institutions. They had employed so much religious staff that now, as the money was lacking, they were not able to pay for this anymore. Yeah, for the remaining followers, this was just too much. Furthermore, from the 8th to 10th centuries, the Jains of Karnataka opened up, we have said, in a very pronounced way, and allowed substantial changes on their own religious structure to be undertaken. Now, initially, these transformations could be positive. We have heard about positive things such as liberalism towards women by the Yapaniyas, accepting lots of converts from different faiths, strengthening the position of the female element with the Yakshis, and accepting large donations to flourish. Yeah, these were initially, you build lots of mattas. This is a matta at Schwanerbergelor from the outside, and the inside it's a courtyard building. It was founded in the late 10th century, but largely built during the 15th and 16th century, what we see today. But the paintings and also the stucco decorations, they were added in the 18th and 19th centuries. So in the long run, however, some of these items, liberalism, converts, female divinities, large donations, contributed also to the gradual weakening. In addition, the Jains do not appear to have been aware of the danger caused by the upsurge of new religious groups in the wider area. Jain leaders were obviously unprepared for a situation of harsh competition, religious competition, which also contributed to their displacement from power. In this context, the Tantric movement, which plays a particular role in Karnataka from the 8th century, followed by the Hindu resurgence. We've heard initially Buddhism and Jainism as heterodox religions flourished, but then Hinduism returns. There is a Hindu resurgence from the 9th century with a powerful bhakti path of devotion from the 10th century, and a particular Shaiva revival within Hinduism. It's particularly Shaiva groups, also heterodox groups, which flourish from the 11th, 12th century. And altogether, this caused irreparable damage to the position of the Jainas in Karnataka, because one challenge, followed another at very short intervals. Tantrism, Hindu resurgence, Bhakti movement, Shaiva revival. It's like bullet shoots almost. These things. Now here I'm showing you that Jainism tried to adapt to these new movements. They actually absorbed tantric elements. So the goddess here on the left, which is Padmavati, she has in the tantric fashion multiple arms. So they made tantric divinities out of their goddesses, and sacred spells, magic spells became very important. And these mantras were written down on yantra disc, incised in metal. And you can see a Bhaktamara yantra down here, and above you can see these yantra discs also today continuing to be used in temple settings. So they tried to incorporate Bhakti and Tantric elements, but for some, they did not do enough. Some still converted, The creation of reform religious movements and the arrival of entirely new faith groups in the area appear to have been the second most decisive factors in the destabilization of the Jains in Karnataka. So which groups did arrive in the area? What do I mean by this? Especially detrimental in this context was, we don't quite know, are they completely new, or is it, I would say, it's probably more a reformed movement of the Virashaivas or Lingayats, which this movement gets reformed or reestablished by Basava in the early mid-12th century. And I'm showing you here on the right a Lingayat boy, and he's typical by wearing a necklace, a container, and this contains a small linga, which is not considered a representation of Shiva, but the divine essence. And every Lingayat or Virashaiva carries this, is given this as a child. And Virashaivism argues that you don't need temples. You wear the linga on your body, and your body is the temple. And so it's a very reduced ritual. But interestingly, because of course for many people this is far too abstract, and people are used in India to a lot of images and colors and rituals. Of course, also the Lingayats, the Virashaivas, introduced what they call fixed lingas in temples, which were initially absorbed from the Jains and other Hindu groups, but also later built. And you can see that sometimes the linga is a phallic element of the god Shiva, but it's the divine essence. Sometimes also in Hinduism, but also by the Virashaivas, a face is fixed to the linga to make it more kind of figurative experience. And then you almost have the feeling that you're looking at a kind of divine image here. Especially early Virashaivism, I would say, probably like all early religions trying to establish themselves in a new area, was quite aggressive and militant. And this turned a financially precarious and religiously highly competitive situation into an outright fight for survival. Now, due to its egalitarian and classless outlook, the Virashaivas appealed especially to lower, to those levels of society considered as of lower standing, because Virashaivism initially rejected all castes. Now we remember that this was actually something which the Jains also initially did, and only by absorbing lots of converts, they had accepted castes. Today, the Virashaivas also have castes, so they seem to creep in. But at this time, it helped people to convert away from from Jainism. Very important is also that the Virashaivas were very active in trade, and that the Jain trading castes or classes converted very quickly to Virashaivism because they found better trading partners in these Virashaivas. Now, although less pronounced, also local Shaivas and Sri Vaishnavas are Bhakti followers of Vaishnavism from Tamil Nadu, contributed to the destabilization of the situation. And I'm showing you here also one example. Of course, also Islam arrives at this time on the northern edges of the Deccan. And this is here the Arachambat Gudi, a 9th to 10th century Jain temple, of which the entrance hall is used also today as a prayer hall by Muslims. And all the important, the sacred sections of the temple here, you can see a doorway have been sealed off. So what was important in a Jain context is disused, is locked. And you can see here also some Islamic graves, Muslim graves on the side. So Islam also contributes to a decimation of influence, but actually the largest damage had been done already by local religious communities. As such, one can conclude that the downfall of Jainism in Karnataka was also strongly due to the aggressive and often volatile activities of other religious groups. And despite this obvious complacency which the Jains displayed here at these difficult times, I would still argue that they reacted more competently to the challenges of these times than the Buddhists, who exactly at the same time in the 12th century kind of dies out in India. You know, it's the same time and often in many ways similar reasons. So the Jains actually survived, although they were very hard hit. Another problem was that Jaina religious society had fragmented. We have said it can be positive, but now we're looking at the negative sides of it, because many of these different groups fought against one another. They fought for supremacy. So Jaina groups argued against one another, and especially the strength of the Japanese, who appealed so much to women, was actually not strategically employed to strengthen the entire faith, but on the contrary, they were isolated and brand-marked as heretics. Yeah. The problem of disintegration was made worse by the fact that the Jainas did not recognize this fragmentation as a problem. You know, also the fact that they had absorbed so many converts. This happened largely from Hinduism in the 4th to 6th centuries. Large groups of Hindus converted to Jainism because Jainism was rising in power, and they brought with them their castes, and they held on to their caste status. And the important step is then that from the 8th century, the Jains accept and reconfirm castes which they didn't have before. Yeah, from this time, the mendicant path of becoming a monk or a Digambara nun. So the monks go naked, the women are forced to wear dress because that would be considered socially unacceptable. And this on this basis, the Digambaras argue that, because women can't control their shame and give up all their belongings, they cannot reach enlightenment. They have to be born as a man. But the path of becoming a monk or a nun from this time onwards, when castes were introduced, was not open to the lower levels of society anymore, because it was unacceptable that a Shudra or a lower caste Jain, could, lead an ascetic or religious life. Had the Jains taken these problems more seriously and tried to remedy them more immediately, the situation could maybe have been saved. However, the periods between individual Jain reformers who could have corrected or reinvigorated the faith were too long at this time in Karnataka. Furthermore, one can argue that the deterioration of Jaina preeminence in the region was due to a certain weakening of their own values. And what is always mentioned here is the idea of homelessness and poverty, which are so central to Jainism, which by accepting donations and properties, which people had to look after, some Jainas gave up. So we have then mattas. This is a matta at Varanga, and we have orange robed. We have dressed they're not fully initiated monks, but semi-initiated monks who are known as Bhattarakas, and they can very easily be recognized by their orange robes. This is the Bhattaraka from Kambatali, and there's a group of Bhattarakas here in this assembly, whilst, the real ascetics, they go naked and they have no belongings. But because people were, the Jains were given so much property and land and buildings, they needed administrators to look after them. Yeah, but it's tempting, but it's also a kind of a risk. So originally the ascetics kind of pledged to abide by the ideals of homelessness and having no possessions, and this was kind of changed here. So on the one side, these administrators lived in the community and they forged closer links, which was very positive. But even at the time, these changes provoked often stark opposition by those taking a more ascetic and austere line to Jainism. So the problem was not one single donation, but the fact that by accepting or building a basti, we had to look after, the Jains had to look after the maintenance, after the ritual, pay for the priests. So one donation demanded always further donations. And, the ascetics, the naked ascetics, had never dealt with kind of finances. And this really changed the kind of religion. The points just discussed illustrate particularly well the conundrum faced by the Jains through the changes which they permitted themselves. They were not forced to do this, but they did this to be attractive in the early phases. Many modifications initially led to a rise in popularity of their faith in Karnataka. However, once they had grown beyond a certain level, these initially helpful aspects could turn into liabilities and problems, which severely changed the outlook of the religion and made it open to criticism. In the long run, it, I would argue, also contributed to its the endangerment of its survival. We have no evidence of a pure and reduced Jainism only focusing on the 24 jinas, and divinities appear to have been part of Jainism from the very beginning. So here we have the jinas, and we have a yaksha and a yakshi, the god and the goddess in the hall. This is something we have from the very early times on. But in the 8th to 10th century, by reacting to bhakti and tantric developments, the pantheon of gods and goddesses was so enlarged and their status so increased that a small number of temples, of basadis, actually have no statues of the jinas anymore, but only goddesses. And here we have the feeling that the goddesses, particularly, it's not gods, but it's always goddesses, kind of almost overpower at certain sites the Jinnas or Tirthankaras, and we have to remember that the Jinnas are far above the gods and goddesses. In Jainism, we believe, Jains believe that gods and goddesses first have to reborn as humans, because enlightenment can only reach to a hard road of suffering and asceticism, and not by being a god who can solve all his own problems. So these gods and goddesses can only help with very minor things. They cannot help you reach enlightenment because they themselves have not reached it. Yeah. So here we have an enormous change. And although we have said, being open to other religions, kind of maybe incorporating ideas such as Hindu divinities or the Bodhisattva ideal in Buddhism can be positive, but you can also reach a point where you become less distinct, where your borders become so opaque that you're not really identifiable as a distinct face anymore. So on the one side, the increase in significance of the yakshis, the goddesses, made Jainism more popular. But once these had started, at least at certain sites, there are very few, but at certain sites, to overpower the Jinnas or Tirthankaras, the newly won status of the goddesses could also endanger the cohesion and clarity of the Jaina path to salvation and kind of remove some of the stability of the faith. In addition to the aforementioned points, and this is my last point, it appears that at least from the 12th century, the Jains lacked possibly strong enough leadership and were not successful any longer in attracting ascetics and teachers who could effectively support and propagate their beliefs, at least in open contest. And at this time of struggle, religious leaders commonly defended their faith in philosophical and theological debates and disputes. This is something which in Tibetan Buddhism also still plays a really important role. And it appears that from the 12th century onwards, the Jain leaders and clergy did not succeed any longer in public intellectual debates. So it was, two leaders of two different religions, having a debate, arguing about philosophical ideas, and one wins. And the one who wins takes all the village converts then, has to convert. So in these debates, the Virashaivas really were very successful, and they really swayed the masses and led to enormous conversions. So through these conversions, the Jains lost physical and financial support, and the Virashaivas were not only quick in debates and very charismatic as leaders. I'm showing you here a present-day guru of a Virashaiva Mutt, an incredibly charismatic, open person who was also very happy to discuss this period of strife, which I found very, very positive, very reflective, self-critical. But at the time, they had very strong militant inclinations, not anymore today. And here on the right, I'm showing you what used to be a Jain temple, and you can see here the lintel with the Jinnah having been broken out. In this temple, all remedies of Jainism were removed, were broken out, and they were scattered around the temple. So when you go towards the temple, you see all these debris, and they placed a linga on the top of the building for everybody to see that this Jain temple has been converted and taken. So after the Virashaivas had defeated the Jainas with words in debates, they persecuted them also physically and had their places of worship destroyed. To conclude, the discussion this afternoon has shown that there were a number of internal reasons within Jainism itself, which appear to have led to a weakening of the faith over the centuries. We are remembering the fragmentation, the castes, the blurring of boundaries, giving up poverty and homelessness, all these issues. In addition, also external reasons such as the loss of political and financial support, as well as the rise of other religious groups in the area we focus particularly on the Virashaivas because this is what the sources, the inscriptions and the texts tell us, that these were kind of the hardest hit group which hit the Jainas. Now, initially, gain and upsurge in influence of the Jainas till the 11th century created dependencies, and in the long run resulted in an enormous fall from power. You know, they had so many financial liabilities that once even if they were just reduced a little bit, the financial support, they could not keep this up anymore. And in addition to these largely political and economic reasons, also social aspects such as the strong egalitarianism attracted followers to Virashaivism, the fact that initially they didn't have castes. So once Jainism had, of course, presented the same opportunity of equality to its converts, and the Japanese had even offered liberation to women, you know, so the Jains in the past had offered the same and were attractive, but they had kind of changed their religion. They had accepted castes and given them a place in Jainism. So instead of strengthening the community as a whole, the Digambara main community did not kind of profit from these subgroups, but absorb and kind of reject them. In addition to these social and gender issues, we must also assume that religious, dogmatic, and ritualistic reasons played a role. The simplicity of Virashaivism found in the veneration of the linga, which you wear on your body, and a strongly reduced ritual offered probably a very attractive alternative to an enlarged Jaina pantheon and an enormously bloated administration. But maybe it's all a question of degree, of quantity, that is, of too little, perhaps in the earlier forms of Jainism, which focused on the jinas, and too much, maybe in the later settled land-owning versions of the faith, and with Virashaivism possibly offering at the time a comfortable and appealing middle way. From one of the foremost religions of Karnataka, only within 200 to 400 years, Jainism sunk to the status of one of the least influential faith groups in the area. And whilst organized, methodical, and widespread discrimination and active maltreatment of the adherents of contending religious groups involving weapons were reasonably unknown during earlier periods of Indian history, the persecution of the Jains during the 12th to 14th centuries, and the images here on the screen illustrate, at least from an art historical point of view, the destruction and the remnants which are still visible to us today of this very difficult time of upheaval, shows a real change in this respect. So we have a real physical kind of fights here. Now, despite this evident decline in influence, however, Jainism has survived the struggles of the later medieval period in Karnataka, and if also in a strongly decimated way. It's a very small community now in Karnataka, but it's still striving and still developing as a religious group today in the south of India, in the state of Karnataka, but also in the whole of India. And here I'm showing you contemporary temple constructions close to Bangalore, the state capital of Karnataka, and you see still the scaffolding in the back. And I find it interesting, for instance, in the example on the top, that the idea of these wonderful ceilings are now kind of translated into glass constructions using new materials, which I think shows that, you know, we are not a backward tradition, but kind of it's alive and thriving, but a religion which is very aware of its history and actually makes it present. They put these decapitated jinas often in very pronounced places, and they say, yes, we have been threatened, but we have survived. And maybe we'll end on this note, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you for your attention.